contaminated land. The biggest point here is, from our industrial days, we have a lot of contaminated land around the United States. There's a policy in place to clean up these contaminated lands. Anyone know what the common name is? Superfund. Has anyone heard of Superfund? So Superfund is established through the federal government as a means of making the companies, if they're still in existence, pay for remediation of their land to bring it back to today's standards so that things can be built on top of that land. So remediating contaminated land, where most often contaminated land is located in desirable locations or places that are already surrounded by development. Anyone know of a good location here in Vegas that's currently being developed somewhat more so? Symphony Park. Symphony Park, right. So Symphony Park, the old Union Railroad station, it's full of diesel and other contaminants in that soil. So recycling and reusing that earth rather than building that Symphony Park somewhere else is kind of what we're going for here. So contaminated land typically is going to exist in an already developed area. It's better to remediate, and not only are you getting those toxins out of that water table or out of that soil, but you're not using virgin land or green fields outside on the city outskirts. Finite fuels and energy sources. I think we all know about peak oil and where the status of oil is today. Water consumption, a big topic here in the valley. That backs up Ring every time you fly in and out of Vegas or at Lake Mead. We can see it's pretty prevalent there. They say water is going to be the next oil. I think oil is still the next oil. They say water is going to be a much more bigger deal in the future, if not already. We've already had large municipalities like Atlanta pretty much shut down all non-essential water use a couple years ago. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of their main reservoir dwindling down. You just have a lot of water rights and a lot of water issues really fostering growth in the past, and now inhibiting growth, especially here in Vegas or in Phoenix. Water rights are a really big issue moving forward. So water rates are going to go up, but when you have low flow fixtures, you're minimizing what? Minimizing your risk of operational costs down the road. So that's another idea, aside from actual cost, a real business idea in terms of risk, right? It's not as risky to install a low flow fixture because you're using less of a resource and not succumbing to potential operational escalations in the future. And that goes for electricity as well. Building efficiency overall, so electricity, water, how occupants move in and out, how productive they are in the facility. If you have employees that are more productive, maybe you don't need to hire as many employees. And that might not be good for the 5 people who are going to be hired, but it's good for you as the boss, as the organization. Ozone protection, keeping CFCs and HCFCs out of the atmosphere, protecting us from skin cancer and harmful UV rays. Energy usage overall, and then finally virgin materials. So we want to reduce, reuse, and recycle. We want to stay away from virgin materials, virgin aggregate, virgin timber, virgin materials across the country and across the world. So reuse resources. So development of land and contaminated land. Once again, so developing in locations that have already been disturbed. It's much more sustainable to develop within an existing urban infrastructure, and it starts to lend itself to community revitalization, to sustainable communities that can last and stand the test of time. So many cities are blighted, especially in the Midwest and in the Northeast, Buffalo, Detroit, from these urban flights out of the urban areas into the outskirts and into the green fields surrounding them. So not only are you causing detrimental effects to green fields, but you're also causing detrimental effects to the society and the economy, those other two legs of the triple bottom line within the city center, within the downtown areas. Gray water system, so reusing something, water is already serving its purpose to wash your hands, why not allow it to still serve a purpose by watering your plants, right? Other non-potable systems, so you'll have purple pipe recycling. You guys ever see the purple pipe, which is secondary treated? It smells like eggy water, but they use that for landscaping, so it doesn't have to go all the way through a sewage treatment plant. It can be secondary treated on site and then used on a golf course or whatever it may be. So you're not pumping it all the way to the plant. You're not using virgin water resources. Building reuse. This is the big one. So think about it. 95% of the buildings that are in existence right now are currently owned, operated, and are standing, right? You might have a small number being built right now and a really small number being built right now, especially in Vegas, right? And so the idea is that the vast majority, nearly all of the existing building stock has the potential to be retrofitted, renovated, upgraded, and made more energy efficient rather than using virgin materials and creating a whole new standalone building. Transportation constraints in terms of shipping, all the costs that come along with that, both environmental and actual physical costs, and then finally building usage. What's an example of building usage? So say you have like a high school or a college campus or a gymnasium, that's only being used 9 months out of the year, right? So it might be more prudent to have church, like at my high school, they had a church there on Sundays, right? No one was in the building on Sundays. They had a church there that rented it out. So instead of this church having to build a new church, they just used this giant high school auditorium that fit their needs very well. So that idea of using a building for more than just its intended purpose, using it in a more 24-hour cycle. Recyclable resources, you get to a lot of the same attributes we talked about previously. Biofuels is another good example. This is something that's already captured carbon and environmental pollutants, and if you don't reuse it, it's just going to go to waste. And so recycling that into the existing environment. Material selection, when you're designing a building, planning for a building, selecting materials that have demonstrated recyclable properties. A lot of times you can go on corporate websites, like United States Gypsum Company, they'll have a whole sustainability section of which of their materials can be sustainable choices in terms of recycled content and where they're located. I'm working on a project right now that'll be the first LEED Silver casino in the country because they won't allow smoking. A lot of casinos might be energy efficient, but most of them allow smoking. But in this state, it's in Ohio, and you can't smoke indoors anywhere. So on that project, they just happen to be in a very beneficial location. The Midwest has a ton of manufacturing of construction goods and construction materials, so they're really in a good region to be able to source their materials within 500 miles. And then finally, quality of materials. So you're looking at materials that are going to stand up to the test of time. Rather than going with cheap carpet or cheap linoleum, you go with terrazzo flooring or concrete flooring, something that's going to be durable for the next 50, 75 years. So you're never replacing it instead of replacing carpet every 3 years or whatever. Protect nature, land conservation, green space. You know, it's important for human beings to be surrounded by green space, to have access to the outdoors. The National Park idea is kind of a touch on that to the extreme, but just having a park in a city center or near your office space. Heat island considerations, like we talked about, trying to keep those temperatures down in urban areas. Chicago has a really big movement from black tar roofs to green roofs, which are roofs that are covered with natural vegetation. This not only filters the water to a much more pure state, but it also keeps the building cool. And remember those cycles, those dominoes, right? So when you keep the top of your roof cool, what happens? You lower your air conditioning, you lower your electricity bill, you're not using as much coal, you have cleaner air, your kid doesn't get asthma, right? Emissions reduction, development density, in terms of units per acre, dwelling units per acre, trying to get above 4, trying to get more than just a single family home on a quarter acre, which would just be a dwelling unit of 4 per acre, which is typical here in America. So moving to that shift. In this course, it's not so much that I try to be political in any way or force views on anybody. This is sustainability defined, right? It's not saying that you have to live this way. What it's saying is if you were to be more sustainable, you would live in an urban environment where you walk to work, we have buildings stacked rather than a single family home. That's all I'm saying. It's not that you have to live in a high-rise building in New York City to be a good citizen, but if you want to be more sustainable, the most sustainable people live in New York, San Francisco, Hong Kong, Tokyo, right? They don't live in the suburbs of Las Vegas, for example. So that's all I'm saying. So when I say those kind of things, it's not that I'm bashing Vegas, because I live here as well. It's that to be most sustainable, you have to move to that kind of living environment. So, and in America, that's not really offered very much. I would say New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and even though those cities to an extent don't really offer that most sustainable lifestyle. You sell people have summer homes, and cars, and automobiles all throughout those communities. So America in general is probably the most consumptive community on the planet. So moving from that to a more sustainable future is kind of what the course is all about. It's not saying you have to live this way, it's just saying these are the sustainable goals or sustainable questions. stormwater runoff. So when you have stormwater runoff, you have a large volume of water running off. That can be detrimental to surrounding areas, floodplains, and also what's running off into the storm sewer, right? Oils, chemicals, things that eventually get into our drinking water. There's always those, the planet, yes, but it's also the people. So who's actually consuming that water in the long run? It's the citizens, it's us, right? Eliminating toxics, starting with low volatile organic compounds. The big one is tobacco smoke. One of the prerequisites, we'll get into the LEED rating system in detail, but it's broken down into prereqs and credits. So what are prerequisites? They are required regardless of the project type. All LEED projects have to have no smoking within the actual building walls themselves. So that's just one omnipresent stipulation. Indoor environmental quality overall. So this can deal with cycle changes in terms of how much fresh air you're actually pulling in. When you're pulling in a lot of fresh air, what do you have to temper that with? What do you have to consider on the other end? It'd be great if you could have fresh air all the time that was cool to our standards, right? What happens when you pull in so much fresh air at a time?
The condition of that.
Right, so you have to cool it down each time that you're bringing in 120 degree air or 110 degree air into a 75 degree environment, right? You have to cool it down to that level. So there's some ways to get around that in terms of how many air exchanges you have and what type of equipment you actually install. We'll get into some of those details, but there are ways to exchange some of the heat and some of the cooling between the air that's being exhausted, which is cool in condition, but it's dirty, it's got particulates in it, and lots of just overall compounds that you don't want to have stagnating in your environment. But it's also tempering that with bringing in the fresh air from outside. Overall emissions reduction, so it not only has to do with your electricity usage, but also how do people get to your building? Are you creating an environment where people are driving really far away to get to your place of employment or place of study or whatever it may be, thereby increasing emissions in that direct vicinity. Water treatment, and then once again, stormwater runoff, eliminating things that can be leached into the soil when it does rain, copper, zinc piping that might be along some of your gutter systems can be toxic to fish that are in the local region. There's all these different steps that you kind of have to think about, and overall it's kind of a building ecology mindset. Right? Applied life cycle analysis, present value of future benefits. The easiest way for you guys to kind of think about this is what you're doing right now as a student. So it might be costing you some money right now to be a student. You might have some opportunity costs. You could have gone and been a mechanic or something else that didn't require necessarily a college degree, but you could have still made money. Or you could just have personal opportunity costs. You could have been backpacking in Europe or sleeping and watching Seinfeld, whatever you wanted to do. There is something you're giving up right now to be here in this room, right? You're sacrificing that to have a life cycle, a lifetime of the benefits of having your BS or MS or whatever it may be, PhD, right? So that same idea of investment up front to reap benefits for 40 years is the idea of life cycle analysis. Really, the crux of how building owners and operators and designers should really make their decisions for their buildings. Reuse materials, applying things that you have on site to the job site will reduce your overall cost to the project. If you're able to crush concrete, crush gravel, and crush asphalt right on site, it's going to be a lot cheaper than sole sourcing it as a virgin material from somewhere else, for example. Quality materials, if you're not replacing something that's often, you're going to get the benefit that much longer, right? You have to look at the analysis between, well, if we install this carpet, we're going to have to replace it every 5 years. Carpet costs this much to install. About inflation, all those different costs across a lifetime, how long is the concrete flooring going to last in contrast to that? So that's the kind of balance you have to do. It may very well be that the carpet runs out because it's so cheap or whatever it may be, but then you have to start looking at the ethical and kind of your environmental side of your business as well. Those other two legs of the bottom line. And maybe that's really cheap carpet, but maybe it gives off a lot of VOCs, right? Efficient equipment, employee productivity. It's not just about the actual building, but it's the inhabitants inside of it that can contribute to your bottom line. Property values, it has been shown that green buildings